Alright, so before we actually start diving into all of the pulleys and everything like that, I wanted to kind of go over an overview of what we have. So, top side of the motor, or basically motor side stuff that we're replacing. Drive belt, that's going to be the first thing to come off. I have both idler pulleys right here. These are AL3Z8678-A. I have two of those, because there's two idler pulleys. I have the tensioner, which is AL3Z6B209-C. So I've got that's going to get replaced. That comes with the pulley on it. I have a brand new water pump. That is AL3Z8501-D. And I also have a gasket, which I think it comes with as well. And so this may be just an extra. And I also have a brand new water pump pulley that I'm going to put on the water pump as well. And that's, put it down here so the camera will actually focus on it. It's AC3Z8509-CA. So I have that as well. Now, in addition to all of that, and I have the thermostat. So brand new thermostat gasket. I'm going to see if I can still get a thermostat housing. It's been on back order for a year. Still waiting on it. I'm going to try and reorder that now. And then I have a bunch of different fasteners. Some of these may be for the radiator, and I'm not going to read out all the part numbers. It's up to you if you want to actually replace the fasteners. Completely up to you if you want to replace the fasteners, because most are reusable. But I'm going to go ahead and replace them all on the front end of the engine. Like I said, some of these may be radiator bolts and stuff, because I'm replacing all those bolts and bushings and everything too. But all the fasteners that I could get from Ford that I can replace, I'm going to replace, because these are all pretty darn cheap. I mean, they're like $1 a bolt for most of these things, which, yeah, is expensive for a bolt in comparison to what you could get at Ace Hardware, but I figured why not? It's inconsequential in terms of the cost of everything else, so I want to do it right and want to replace it all. So let's go ahead and hop over to the truck again. Belt's going to come off. That's going to be the first thing that we got to do, and we're going to work through everything else step by step. I think I'm probably going to start with water pump if access is pretty good and everything and whatnot. And if the idler pulleys are above, I might do those instead first. I just don't want to basically I want to do all the dirty stuff first and do all the clean stuff afterwards. So if it's going to dump coolant all over new stuff, I'm not going to do the new stuff first. So we're going to go head over to the truck and see what we can get done. Alrighty, so we're going to start on the belts and water pump and everything now. And you can see I have the belt off now. So this is the alternator up here, and the belt normally loops around right here. Took it loose just using the tensioner. So any vehicle, modern vehicle that uses a serpentine belt is super easy. I took in this case it's a 1/2-inch drive, just ratchet. I put a cheater pipe on it, so I had a lot of extra leverage, because this is actually a pretty tight tensioner. And then you just wrench it clockwise. So with the ratchet like this, I push down on it like that. Wrench it clockwise. It pulls the belt loose. You can pull the belt off, just the top pulley. And from this point, you can basically get to anything else that you want to as far as the other pulleys and pulling the belt off and everything. So I'm replacing the belt. I'm going to pull it off. Make sure you're either mindful of your belt routing or you have a diagram of it. It should be in the owner's manual, I would guess. I'm sure you can find it online as well. I have the video, obviously, to remind me of where it is too, and you will as well. So any of those will work. And at this point, we're ready to start actually replacing things. So what we're actually going to replace is this idler pulley right here, this idler pulley right here, the tensioner right there that I showed you, and then the water pump, which is right in the middle with its pulley. So we'll go through the whole process of removing all of those and replacing all of those right now, starting with the tensioners. Those are above the water pump, so once I pull that out, I shouldn't get anything on these. We're starting with these guys, and you can see this one's a little bit loose now. It's not the bearing, I loosened it up a bit. This one, nice and tight. There's a little bit of sound that I can hear from when they roll, so they're not dead yet, but it's a good thing that we're changing them preventatively. So, bolt right here, 13 millimeter, and all you have to do is take I just took a long flex head 3/8" drive ratchet on the front of it, cracked it loose, and we're going to be able to unthread this bolt here. Please hold while we unthread. And looks like the pulley's held on a standoff, which is nice. That's convenient for me. Set the bolt aside and the pulley should just walk right off. Yep. And you can see its little mounting boss right there. So, old pulley. I'm going to save these just as spares, just in case of emergency type of thing. But new one's going to install on. and I will give you a torque spec and show you what the finished product of the two new idlers looks like in just a second. Alrighty, so like I mentioned, we have new idler pulley, new bolts. The pulley part number I mentioned earlier. The bolt part number, now that I'm seeing which bolt is which, is this one right here, N808102-S437. I've got two of those, one for each pulley. You compare them to the old bolts. All good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the new pulley and pulleys and bolts into the truck. Okay, so we have the new tensioner installed. Old one right there, just so you can have a 50-50 shot. I didn't put the other one on yet. And torque spec, 18 foot-pounds, 25 Newton meters. And what I always like to do is put just a tiny, tiny dab of Loctite right on the end of the bolt, so it works up the threads as you thread it in. And so it helps just a little bit extra with keeping something that's vibration prone, like something mounted on an engine, in place. So low strength Loctite, the purple stuff, I throw a little bit on there, 18 foot-pounds. Gonna go ahead and swap out the other pulley and then we'll move on to the water pump. Alright, so now that we got the pulleys installed on the truck, we're moving on to the water pump. Now, this is how the water pump comes, at least whenever you buy a new one. This is part number, again, AL3Z8501-D, and it's got the O-ring pre-installed. I actually ordered an extra one that I won't need, so just something to note if you're ordering one of these. It comes with that pre-installed. You're definitely going to want to grease that before you install this, but we'll get to that whenever we get to that. And then, like I mentioned, I'm replacing the water pump pulley as well, just because we're in there. And this is Ford part number AC3Z8509-CA. So we're throwing one of those in. And I'm also throwing in all new screws as well, but I don't know the part number for those screws until we get to it. So I don't know which screws they are out of my giant stash of them. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to pulling the water pump out of the truck. It looks like it's just 4 bolts that hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it should just right out of the truck. I believe we're going to need to pull the pulley off to get the bolts out, but don't quote me on that until we get in there. So we'll head on over there and see what we get. Alright, so this is the water pump right here, like I mentioned earlier, and you can see I already have the pulley loose. The 4 bolts are already out. We can just pull the pulley off from here, hand it over, and then we have 1 bolt, 2 bolts, 3 bolt right down there, and then 4 bolts right there. And so to get the pulley off, 10 mil socket, I'm guessing to get these ones off, it looks like these are 10 mils as well, so it should be pretty easy. You do have to pull the pulley off to get these bolts out, because I believe this one and that one down there are hidden underneath. Either way, one of them's hidden behind the pulley such that it looks like, to me at least, that you can't get it off without pulling the pulley off. Now, to get the pulley off, I just used a impact driver with a 10 millimeter socket on it, just a really stubby air impact. You can use that, that'll take them off really easily. Don't know about putting it back on yet, but you're gonna want to torque that to spec, so we'll figure that out in a minute. Otherwise, if you have a good strap wrench, you can wrap it around the pulley, hold it in place, and crack them loose individually. But that said, I don't have a very good strap wrench right now on hand that'll work for this, so unfortunately that was not an option for me. But you can see we're now here where we can get to the water pump. I can actually feel a little bit of, just a little bit of play in it, so it's not totally worn out yet, but it's a good thing we're replacing it and might as well do it while we're in here. They're really cheap. Next step, like I said, is to crack these 4 bolts loose, and we should be pretty much home free as far as getting the whole water pump out and everything goes. So I'll follow back up once we have made some progress. All right, so as you can see, I got the water pump out now. That was a real pain. I ended up having to use a bunch of different pry bars and everything because the gasket was so kind of rotted away and turned into goo and was really holding the water pump in there. I'll show you on the workbench what I'm talking about here in a second, comparing it to the new pump. But I got the water pump out. Basically, the way that I did it was by prying up against the sides of the alternator, like right here and right here, using a long pry bar. I used a mallet to kind of knock it around, knowing that that's going to destroy the bearings in the water pump and that I'm replacing it, so don't do that if you're going to reuse a water pump and have to remove it for some reason. But knocked it around doing that, and then I was able to get a pry bar kind of up and under in here on the top bolt ear of the water pump that goes right here. Maybe able to get you a view of, you can see the bolt hole right there. I was able to kind of get between that and the block itself and pop the water pump out from there. So we got the water pump out, and what I did was clean up the mating surface for the O-ring, which is the inner diameter right here with Scotch-Brite, some green Scotch-Brite, So very, very, very mild abrasive, just to clean the corrosion off and everything. There was a decent amount of corrosion again, which made it a pain in the butt to get out. So that's all cleaned out. I cleaned off all down here, although there's now Scotch-Brite dust all underneath there, so I'm gonna need to blow that out or something once I get the water pump in there to seal off the block itself. And basically at this point, we're ready to install the water pump. So once you pop it out, make sure you clean up the bore. Make sure you feel it with your finger or all the way around to make sure it's smooth. And if it is, you should be good to go to pop the new one in. So we'll go over to the bench, show you the prep for that, and we'll get the new pump installed. We're here on the bench now, and we have the old water pump and new water pump right next to each other, as well as the old water pump bolts. First thing I want to mention, water pump bolts. They are the part number W503298-S439. You need 4 of them if you want to replace them. Right there. So, old bolts, they'll just go with the old water pump. This will just go into a bag and either get tossed or stored or something. Either way, new one right here. So, what I wanted to show you on the old one is the amount of corrosion and everything all around the O-ring. The fact that the O-ring was starting to kind of smear and almost disintegrate in some spots. And you can see in some areas too where it was actually kind of seeping past and collecting grime and whatnot past the O-ring. I believe this is towards the bottom, and naturally coolant is going to kind of want to seep that way and everything whenever the engine's off and it's not pumping. And over time it did start to seep and everything. So water pump itself, the impeller, it looks like it's in good shape. It turns really easily. Doesn't have a bunch of play in and out. It wasn't coming out of either of the wheat ports. I think that there's 2 on this one. It looks like it at least. But actually it looks like it's in reasonably good shape other than the beating that I gave it to the water pump shaft and to the bearings, taking it out. So that's the old one. The new one looks beautiful, like I'd showed earlier. And one thing I want to mention is on the O-ring, before you install the water pump, you're going to want to lubricate it with something. Now, some people will say to use a certain type of grease. Some people will say to use coolant. I mean, your opinion is your opinion. What the factory service manual says is what the factory service manual says, and I don't know what it says, to be honest with you. But what I use for all the O-rings like this is Krytox grease. So I've applied a thin coating of Krytox grease all the way around, so it should be ready to rock and roll and go into the block. Block, like I mentioned, is cleaned up over on the truck, so we should be ready to go. Got the new bolts, got the new water pump. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing put into place and bolts torqued down. I'll let you know what the torque spec is once I show the finished product, and we can move on to, I think we'll go ahead and install the tensioner before we install the water pump pulley, just so we have everything kind of out of the way to get to that tensioner. So hop on over back to the truck and show you what's going on there. As you can see, we have the brand new water pump installed. Looks nice and fresh on the front of the engine. I do not have the new pulley on there yet, and next step is going to be replacing the tensioner right here, actually. So that tensioner, I believe, is held on with 3 10mm bolts. The bolts are definitely 10 mil. We'll double check the count, and I'll show you the location on the tensioner with it off the truck. But we have at least 1 here, 1 there, and then 1 right back there, if you can see it. I know the camera doesn't like to focus very well when there's light there, but we've got those 3 bolts. I believe that's it. Tensioner should come right off the truck, and the new one should go just right on. Gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll proceed with the rest of the water pump job. All right, so old tensioner's off, came off super easy. One thing I want to show you while we're on the bench, looks like this whole design on the arm and everything is the same, but I'm noticing that the pulley is metal on the old one and plastic on the new one. So I'm sure that's a cost-saving thing done by Ford. But what I'm going to do, just like with a lot of the other old parts, I'm going to keep this as a spare. And if I ever have an issue with the pulley, I at least have a metal one to go back to as a backup. Otherwise, everything clocks in the same. It's super simple. It literally just comes straight off the front of the engine, goes straight back onto the front of the engine. So I'm going to go ahead and get this back on here in a second. Before I do that, I want to go over the bolts. So these are the old bolts that came out right here. I have 3 of them sitting right here. And you can see, comparing it to the new one, identical bolt. This one is Ford part number N808920-S437. They come in packs of 1. For some reason I ordered 4 instead of 3. I guess I over-ordered by 1 or just ordered an extra or something. But those are the new bolts that we're going to use with this guy right here. I'm also going to use just a tiny dab of Loctite 222, which is super low strength purple Loctite. I like to use just the tiniest dab on these bolts even when I'm torquing them to spec. just to make sure that everything is going to stay in place on that engine. So I did the same with the water pump. Going to do it with this. Go ahead and put this sucker back on, and then I'll show you the finished product as well as tell you what the torque spec is. Tensioner is now installed, as you can see, and the bolts are all torqued to spec, which is 20 foot-pounds. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but the water pump bolts are the same exact torque spec, as are the bolts for the water pump pulley. So pulley's not installed yet. That's going to be next, but those are going to be the same torque spec. So you can see, tensioner is installed, everything's aligned. We can turn it nice and smoothly. Definitely check that because the clearance is pretty tight to the timing cover. So if something were, if there were a manufacturing defect issue type of thing, it wouldn't clear perfectly, but you can see tensioner's good. Those idlers that we installed are good, and that water pump looks beautiful there. So gonna go ahead and put that water pump pulley on, and in order to tighten those bolts and torque them to spec, I think we're gonna have to put the serpentine belt on as well, which is no problem. I can go ahead and put that on right now, since it's not really gonna get in our way in any way. And we're gonna go ahead and move forward from there. Okay, so before we put on the water pump pulley, I was gonna put that on, but we're gonna go ahead and throw on the thermostat housing and thermostat instead. We're gonna have a little bit more room and everything to work with the belt out of there. And since I need to put the belt on to tighten up the water pump pulley more than likely, I'm gonna go ahead and just do all this stuff as well right now. So, at least, should I say first, before I do the water pump pulley. So, I was actually able to get the thermostat housing, which is part number RH194 or AL3Z8592-A. It was on back order for quite a while, so I finally got this guy. I was planning on replacing it, and then thought, okay, maybe I won't be able to whenever I couldn't get it for a while, and then luckily I was able to get it. So I got that in, and I got the screws in for it, and just replacing those like I am with everything else. W503278 S437, which is just 2 of those. And then, of course, I've got a thermostat and a thermostat gasket. I've got a couple of thermostat gaskets and the thermostat itself, which is RT1234 7L3Z8575-D, and then RG571 F1VY 8255-A. So, all the thermostat stuff's here. I'm going to go ahead and show you in the truck what we're looking at, and we'll pop it off. Should be able to pop it off really quick, pop the new one pretty quick, and we're going to be ready to rock and roll on all of this stuff as well. And we'll be able to put that pulley on too. So I'm going to go ahead and hop on over to the truck and go through that process. Alrighty, so we have the thermostat housing right here, and we have 2 8mm bolts, one right there and one down in there that are kind of hard to see because of the lighting, but basically all we got to do is get a ratchet on there with an extension. Probably going to use a longer one than this. Going to knock those guys loose, and then this housing right here should just lift out, and we should have access right then and there to the thermostat. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera so I have both hands, and we'll come back and go from there. You can see we have the thermostat housing off now. It's right up here, and I just want to take a little bit of information down as far as how the thermostat is sat in place before I remove it. I haven't touched the thermostat yet, but this is how it's set in the truck. This is the original one in this vehicle from 2011. So you can see the O-ring sitting on top of it. It's obviously been very compressed, but that's it. It's just sitting right on top there. And the thermostat itself, you can see the little weep port right there, facing basically directly forwards on the block, and the little well that's in there. So to get it out, all we really have to do is pull it straight out. Again, I'm gonna need both hands to do that because I'm using one to balance and one to film, but I'm gonna get that pulled out and then throw the new one in and go through the install process there. Before I put in the new thermostat and thermostat housing, I just wanted to do kind of a comparison between old and new. Could have really reused this old housing, just would have needed to clean it up a lot. It's just got a lot of crust and everything, especially because it was leaking past the radiator hose was leaking past the housing, past the clamps and everything, because I had those gosh darn worm gear clamps on there. So, but that's the old housing, new housing, obviously exactly the same stampings almost. This is just dated 2021, whereas this one's from 2010. And then you can see the screws, same screw, old versus new, and the thermostats themselves. The gasket, obviously, this one is all compressed and everything, but they are identical, other than just some stamping differences and stuff in them, same part numbers and all. So that's what these guys look like, and I'm going to go ahead and just throw this in the same orientation. It'll set in place in the engine like so. Gasket should just go right on top, and the housing will go on top of that, and you can kind of see how this seals on the outside of the housing on this chamfer around the edge and kind of sits into place. and compresses the gasket down towards the thermostat as well as out towards the walls. So that's how this whole sealing system works. And then I'm going to obviously install the new bolts as well. I couldn't find a torque spec for those, by the way, for what it's worth. The larger water pump bolts, being larger in diameter, as you can see by comparison here, I believe these are these are probably going to be M8s, and this looks like an M6, just visually. So those were torqued to, I believe, 20 foot-pounds. These are going to be, I'm going to just set them to 15 foot-pounds, torque them down. I'm going to use a torque wrench still just to make sure that the torque's nice and even. This is compressing nice and evenly. And of course, I'm going to use a little bit of Loctite on these as well. So I'm going to go ahead, get these installed, and show you what the finished product looks like on the truck. Okay, we got the new thermostat housing installed, all new hardware, all new everything. New thermostat, of course, as well. I ended up doing the torque for the bolts to 12.5 foot-pounds. So keep that number in mind. Again, not something that I was able to find online, but that's about as far as I was comfortable going as far as torque goes. I initially had my wrench set for 15, wasn't hitting that, and I was getting to the point where I was feeling uncomfortable with the amount of torque that I was putting on a bolt that small. So I backed it down just a little bit, 12.5 foot-pounds, and that's what I ended up doing. So for what it's worth, that's what I did on this truck. Again, with a little bit of Loctite as well, so that helps lubricate the threads a little bit going in, and will help lock them in long term. So that's done. Now we can move on to doing the initial install of the water pump pulley and snugging up those bolts as best we can without a belt in there, and then throwing the belt on and finishing up basically the front of the engine stuff. Well, we have success. You can see that we have the new belt installed. I have all 4 of the water pump pulley bolts all torqued down to spec. Again, with that little dab of Loctite. Putting the belt on worked perfectly. I was able to just torque it to spec, no problem. The engine didn't even budge as far as turning the belt or anything goes. So torquing those to spec with the belt on is the move. Honestly, if you're gonna take them off and you don't have an impact, just break them loose whenever the belt's on before you take it off. I just didn't do that and didn't want to put the belt back on, so I got an impact and zipped those out whenever I was doing all the disassembly. So you can see from up here, basically everything on the front of the engine is new. I mean, obviously we didn't replace the alternator, any of the accessories, any of the other accessories, no crank pulley, but everything else in the accessory drive system is brand new. And then we have the new thermostat and thermostat housing up here as well. So that is it for the front of the engine. The only other thing that we're gonna do, and that I didn't mention initially in the video, is I'm gonna replace the oil cooler housing here where the oil filter is. It's a thing that's known to leak, especially on higher mileage trucks, and I'm sure, you know, changing coolant and coolant change interval has something to do with it. But while I'm in here and while I'm doing the whole cooling system, I might as well do that too. So should be pretty darn easy. I have that on order, it's not here yet. But yeah, that's the whole front of the engine. So I think, honestly, that's probably gonna be my next step while I have everything out of the truck. And then we're gonna move on to all the radiator and hoses and everything. You can see the fan shroud's out. I ended up having to order a new fan shroud too. One of the motors, one of the fan motors, the ball bearing started falling out of the motor, which was interesting. Haven't seen that one before, but gonna replace that too. But that has no bearing on how to do the process. It's just gonna be reassembly with a new part. So for the moment, I'm gonna take a pause in real life. You're gonna take a pause for a couple seconds, and we're gonna pick back up when we pick back up and have more parts. So we're back after a little bit of real life break time, and unfortunately the oil cooler has not shown up. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and move forward with the radiator replacement, because that's not supposed to show up the oil cooler for the next few days. I'm gonna go ahead and do the radiator behind the condenser, and then I'm gonna do the heater hoses, which we haven't addressed yet, but those two I can do today. They're not really gonna get in my way for the rest of the job or anything, so I'm gonna go ahead and knock those out. One thing I wanna point out before we get into any details, you can see some leakage over there. That's actually from the coolant leak that was up on the top port of the radiator over here. So no worries there. There's nothing else leaking as far as this goes, and I'm gonna have to get in there with a pressure washer or something after I finish this job and kind of wash the condenser out and everything to get all the coolant staining and gunk that's accumulated up in there off. So anyway, first thing I'm gonna knock out is the radiator change. Should be pretty simple. I'm gonna start with popping loose the clips here on this side to loosen this flap, as well as the 3 on this side to loosen this flap, the little air dam flaps. And that's gonna give me access to the 2 little mounting tabs that clip the AC condenser into place on the radiator. And it's also going to give me access to the transmission cooler lines that go into the radiator. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop these loose, and then we're gonna move forward with, and I'll show you details on getting those lines off, because that's gonna be the next step. Okay, we have the side panels removed now. The one over here, like I mentioned, is 3 clips, and if you want to totally remove it like I ended up doing, there's a clip or screw right there, depending on how your truck's set up. And there's 2 clips down here. One you can see right there, and there's one right behind right there where that hole is. And then on this side, you just have the 2 clips on the condenser, and then you have one up on the headlight, or again, a screw, depending on how it's set up. So now we can see we have access to the clips that hold the condenser in, or condenser onto the radiator. There's one on either side. The other one is right here behind this janky wiring that I need to fix. The other one's right there. And then on the transmission cooler side of things. So the radiator has a transmission cooler built in. Obviously this is your auxiliary one, but the radiator has its own built in. And what we need to do is remove the lines off of that and pull the fluid out of that. Now the important part and the nuance of this is that if possible, and that's what I'm going to try to do here, we're going to capture the fluid and measure it so we can put back in the exact same amount of fluid as comes out, so our transmission fluid level doesn't change. We're not low on transmission fluid. It should be maybe 4 ounces or so from what I understand that ends up coming out. So I'll show you that. But my plan of attack is I'm going to pull this upper line off. There's probably going to be a little bit of fluid that comes out there, and I'll have something sitting down here because there's plenty of open room down there to catch it. And then I'll go ahead and cap off the port here. I have a couple caps that came with the new radiator, and I also have some other vacuum caps and stuff. I may end up bagging and zip tying this line depending on how much fluid keeps on coming out. And I'm basically going to repeat the process down here. Now when we pull off this line, because the fluid is full in the trans cooler that's built into the radiator from basically here to here, we're going to need to have a container ready that can hold all of that fluid. Like I said, from what I've heard and from what I've seen, it's not a lot, but I'll have whatever I can down here to be able to capture and measure it. Doesn't have to be a measuring cup. You can always pour from another container into a measuring cup, of course. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and I'll show you once I've done it kind of what worked for me. So we'll meet back up in a second. Transmission cooler is now disconnected. You can see I have the lines kind of bagged off and zip tied. This is how I like to cap off lines. This is shoving a bolt in there, since it can tear up the inside of the hose and then cause leaks whenever it goes on a barb. And then I have caps, basically capping off the 2 ports on the radiator itself so it doesn't drip all over the place whenever I pull it out of the truck. I just got a bolt and a piece of tubing there, and then I actually have a vacuum cap down there, so it works. And you can see how much transmission fluid came out. It wasn't very much, less than I've seen on some videos. So I don't know if that's because of the order that I pulled the lines in. I basically pulled the bottom line, let the fluid come out that came out, and then pulled the top one. And by doing that and not having airflow able to flow in and basically pull fluid out via gravity, it may have just kept some fluid in there in the radiator. So I'm gonna, once I pull the radiator out, pop both of those off and see if any more fluid comes out, because I do need to replace that obviously if it comes out with the radiator. So that's disconnected now. So at this point, really all we need to do to remove the radiator is unclip the 2 clips after we've taken out the 2 bolts. But before we do that, if you remember, I left the lower radiator hose connected. So I'm gonna go ahead and run over to the workbench really quick and show you what the new radiator hose looks like and how it unclips from the radiator. And I'll show you the situation in the truck. It's very simple, and I have plenty of room. I just want to show you on the bench, because it's hard to get a camera in there, how it actually unclips. So we'll run over to there and then run back to the truck. All right, so we have the new radiator hose right here, the new lower one, and you can see the way that this is set up is with a kind of spring clip and quick disconnect system. So it's got a hard plastic elbow and a little spring clip that holds this to the radiator. Now to remove the spring clip, essentially all you need to do is get a pick or a screwdriver or something in there and pull it out and lift it out, and you can see it kind of unclipped right there. And if I push it, it clips back in. And what that does internally is unclip those 3 prongs. So what I'm going to do is just pull the spring completely out of the old hose, and that way I know everything's completely disconnected. Just wiggle it off the radiator, and then we're going to be good to go to pull the radiator out. Okay, and now to show you access to the lower radiator hose, you can see it right there. We have the spring clip right there, and then the other one, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it's just kind of hiding underneath. And all the other ends of the hose are disconnected, as you remember. So we're ready to pull that out. I'm gonna go ahead and pull it out off camera, and I'm gonna pull the hose completely out of the truck, and then we're gonna be ready to pull the radiator out, and I'll show you where the last couple things are for that. All right, you can see the radiator hose is released right down there. I still left it tucked in there just so I remember exactly how its routing is. And the last thing that we need to do is remove the radiator, or loosen the radiator bolts to remove the radiator. And of course we have to pull off the little overflow hose too, but that's right there next to this bolt. So we have a 13 mil bolt here that has this rubber isolator. I'm not sure if that's gonna fall off, but I did buy new ones to replace them. And then we have another bolt right over here on that ear of the radiator, and again with another rubber isolator right there. So if you want to replace everything, you can get 2 of those and 2 new bolts as well, which I did. And like I said, we're just gonna have to pull this hose off. I have a new one, but we'll just leave it there for the moment once we pull it off. So gonna go ahead and remove those 2 bolts, and then the radiator should just unclip from the condenser, or rather the condenser should unclip from the radiator with those clips down there. And we should be able to kind of tilt the radiator out just a little bit and pull it straight out of the truck. We're gonna need to obviously take the fuse box back off the core support and fold it over the engine like we did for the fan shroud, but we should be able to get the radiator out even easier than the fan shroud, I think. So onward with that, and I think the next time that you'll be seeing the video is gonna be with the radiator out of the truck. Okay, so you can see the radiator's still in there, and the reason it is because I have a PSA that you should take out your air box if you're gonna be changing a radiator. Now the stock one may totally clear, I don't know, I haven't worked on a stock truck yet, because mine came to me with the aftermarket intake, but the air box is way too big, kind of pinches the wiring harness between the radiator and the box, so it doesn't let the radiator tip forward enough to get the condenser unclipped, is the issue that I was running into right now. And as you saw earlier in the video, it was a huge pain to get the fan shroud out with the box in. So I'm going to leave the box out for the rest of the job. Normally there's 2 grommets there that it mounts in. I think the stock one probably just slips into those. The aftermarket one that I have did not fit in there the same way as a stock one would, and it had like some, basically some barb fittings that you'd normally use for pipe or hose or anything like that. Screwed into the bottom of it that went down into those grommets, and the problem was that I ran into, I couldn't pull the airbox out because the barb fittings were so tightly in the grommets. So I ended up having to drill the barb fittings out to get the airbox out, and then drill the rest of the fitting out to get the grommets out, and had a little bit of a party here just doing that. So tons more space. Now we should be able to tip the radiator forward enough, because you do need to tip it towards the engine to get it pulled out. So that again is going to happen off camera, and we're going to move forward from there. Okay, you can see we now have the radiator out. We just have the AC condenser in there. Couple things, like I mentioned, airbox, take it out. Stock one, maybe you can leave it in. This line right here, I had to disconnect to kind of get it up and over the radiator cap. You definitely have to get it all the way up and over. So I ended up just disconnecting and tying off the mating line there. That's for the power steering system. I think while I'm in here, I'm also gonna end up just replacing the power steering lines that go up to the power steering cooler that's built into the condenser, just because they're super easy to access here right now, and otherwise they're kind of a pain to do so. So those are gonna get replaced. I'm gonna get those on order. And otherwise, I've just been kind of cleaning stuff up since I took the radiator out. So spilled a little bit of transmission fluid, just a couple drops, so I had to wipe some of that up. Spilled that kind of down there. I still need to take the lower radiator hose out. And then if we come around to this side, I've got some wiring that I want to clean up and sheath and whatnot. So I've got a little bit of cleanup stuff to do, and then we're gonna move forward. All right, so I've done some more cleanup and everything. I've sleeved some more wires, like the harness back there, which I uncovered and need a little bit of sleeving and everything. So there's a couple things that I'm gonna do in addition to what I mentioned earlier. I'm going to, since I'm keeping my same AC condenser, replace the foam up here. It's just completely falling apart and disintegrating. So I'm gonna go find some foam stripping or something from a hardware store and find something that's compatible with that matches. And then the other thing I want to show is the little radiator mounts here, which are just the little rubber guys that should just pull out. I see how they work. Pulls out this way, slides in and out like that. These I'm going to replace as well, just because I have them and I ordered them. So I'm going to go ahead and swap these guys out. I'll show you the hardware on the bench just to give you the part numbers and everything, and that's probably going to be it for today, because I'm waiting on some parts. I'm going to be waiting on the power steering lines and then the foam stripping. So for you, it's going to be the next clip, but I'm going to pick this video back up once I have some more parts.